Welcome, welcome our MC, CHCI Public Policy Fellow, Luis Chavez.
Buenas tardes a todos. Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. Perfect. I hope you guys have had a great conference. You guys have been learning a lot. Sorry to kind of end it on a sour note. But I am delighted to be here today. My name is Luis Fernando Chavez, CHCI Public Fellow from Kansas. Shout out Kansas. Today we are going to be talking about Project 2025, Unveiled Implications for the Latino Community and National Policy. As a proud immigrant from the state of Durango, Mexico, and somebody whose life was shaped by the educational opportunities afforded to me in this country, this topic resonates very deeply with me. Diversity and immigration has always been the cornerstone of the United States, and it's what makes this country great. And the dangerous policy agenda of Public 2025 is something we need to be paying close attention to, as it holds deep implications for the success of the Latino community and the future of education in this country. It is now my pleasure to introduce our welcoming remarks from our session chair, Representative Adriano Espaillat. Representative Adriano Espaillat was elected in 2016 to serve the people of New York's 13th District. He is the first Dominican American to serve on the U.S. House of Representatives. And Congressman Espaillat is a member of the U.S. House Committee on Appropriations, the U.S. House Committee on Education and Labor, and is the chair of the CHCI board. So give it up for Congressman Espaillat.
Muy buenas tardes. Okay, you had a long day. All right, I see you made it through, right? Well, thank you. This is such an important session, right? I thought it was critical that we talk about this in a nonpartisan, transparent way about Project 2025 and what it can do to our nation. Latino voters must be informed about our election procedures and know their rights, their full rights, to safeguard the future of our communities and democracy. The ongoing voter suppression campaign and efforts are silencing many of our voices, particularly Latino Americans across this country. So within this 920-page manifesto, I believe strongly that conservatives have attacked every aspect of American life. That is why we must educate ourselves about the voting process, understand the proposals that are there, and make informed choices for our communities. 36.2 million Latinos are eligible to vote this year. I hope it's much more, because we're still pushing to register more. The power is right here in your hands in the room. The power is in your hands. I urge you to watch the speech by the late and great Adam Clayton Powell Jr., former congressman from Harlem. What's in your hand? You ought to watch this, because your hand may be empty, but the power in it cannot be measured by regular terms. So please educate yourself, have a final discussion about this particular issue. Let's have a great conversation. Thank you all for being part of today, and I'll see you tomorrow at the gala. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you, Congressman Adriano Espaillat. It is now my pleasure to announce our moderator, Astrid Galvan. Astrid is the editor of Axios Latino, a bi-weekly newsletter focused on U.S. Latino and Latin American issues. Previously, she was a national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press. Please give me a good welcome to our moderator, Astrid Galvan.
to be here with you today. We have an exciting session coming up for you. We will pretend that the Vice President was not on the stage an hour ago. Let's go ahead and welcome our panelists. Please welcome Lourdes Rosado, President and General Counsel of the Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. And next, welcome Dr. Elena Rios, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Health Foundation. Next, we have Thomas Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF. And finally, Dr. Rachel Pereira, a fellow in governance studies with the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. Thank you to CHCI for hosting this leadership conference and focusing attention on what Project 2025 means for the future of federal policy and how it may impact governance in our communities. Participants, please feel free to post your comments about this at #CHCIHHM, and please submit any questions you might have through the app. We will get to those later in the program. All right, let's get started. So, first I want to talk about, let's start with you, Lourdes. What are the parts of Project 2025 that are already being implemented or already exist, and what does that mean for the rest of the document?
Yeah, that's a great question, Astrid, because the reality is Project 2025 is not some hypothetical future. It is here and it is now. For years, actors at the local and state levels around the country have been working to implement key provisions and have received a lot of success, actually. And to the extent that provisions haven't been, or elements of the plan have not been implemented, they've been laying the groundwork, the foundation for future implementation. I think I'll give two examples to start us off, and they both pertain to children, education, and child labor laws. On the education front, we've seen the folks that are behind Project 2025 really encourage and support individuals who share their outlook, run for school boards, encourage them to become members of their school boards. And with that, school boards have a lot of influence and power to shape curriculum. We've seen this movement to get on school boards and to use that power to, for example, prevent teaching about racism or slavery, to remove books like Memoir of Justice Sotomayor or a biography of Roberto Koblenty on the local level. So there have been a lot of efforts to do that. And that's percolated up to the state level. So you'll have, like in Florida, the Stop Woke Act that is really trying to dictate what teachers teach in school. Last night I was in New York City at a Lawyers Committee award ceremony where they were honoring students and teachers in Arkansas, at a high school in Arkansas, who challenged the state's Anti-Indoctrination Act. Well, what that act really meant was that they couldn't teach AP African American history for credit. So there are examples of that going on. On the child labor side, again, Project 2025 talks about basically weakening child labor protections, right? Now, a lot of us saw last year the New York Times powerful series on migrant children being exposed to really dangerous working conditions in factories and slaughterhouses and working really long hours. The Washington Post says that there are at least 16 states with bills currently pending to further weaken laws, but we already have examples of states that have passed those laws. So, for example, Iowa just passed a law that allows minors to work in jobs that were previously deemed too dangerous, like industrial laundries and in demolition and roofing. Indiana is basically repealing all work hour restrictions for 16 and 17-year-olds, and Florida allows 16 and 17-year-olds to work 7 days a week in a row. So it's here, it's happening.
And in terms of the parts of Project 2025 that are not already happening, which parts can be implemented easily, per se? We know it's the government we're talking about. Nothing is easy, but what are some of the policies that concern you? And I'd love to hear from each of you, sort of starting here in this order, about those policies that can be implemented easily.
Yeah, I would start off with in the immigration realm. We've seen a lot of proposals that are designed, frankly, to bring back some of the cruelest policies around implementation that have been implemented in recent years to police and go after immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants. There also contain proposals to eliminate several pathways to legal migration, and just really also to make life, take us back to the 1990s. A lot of you may not remember, but the 1990s was where I remember a real spate of anti-immigrant measures, again, on the local, state, and federal level, that really made it hard for immigrants, both documented and undocumented. So on the enforcement side, the proposals include reinstating the horseback-mounted Border Patrol. Now, people will remember a few years ago, there was this horrible, horrible situation in Del Rio, I think it was around 2021, where we saw photos of these horse-mounted Border Patrol going after Haitian immigrants, like pursuing them. It's like it's just so viscerally wrong. And also, a lot of us do remember here a period when ICE, for example, would show up at churches and hospitals and schools to try to capture people, to detain people. And that's currently not permitted, but under Project 2025, it would be. And I think on the legal pathways front, it would definitely eliminate, they would eliminate DACA and temporary protected status. They would eliminate the special visas, T visas, U visas, that are designed for people who are victims of abuse and crimes, and really try to, again, narrow the pathway. And a lot of this is something that the administration, a new administration can do, a new federal administration can do.
Dr. Rios?
I think one of the most important things that could happen right away, because it's happened in every Republican administration, is to change the education about women's health. And for women's reproductive health, we've always seen in a Republican administration that you see abstinence as the principled way to provide funding to schools instead of sex education. So this time, we're going to go even further, seeing further changes in women's reproductive health, and I'm just going to give a couple examples that can happen right away. One is to reverse the FDA decision to allow the pill of birth control pills now are not prescription, and that'll be changed. Any type of family planning type of education would be changed. And the other thing is there's a whole law about conscious protections for providers. Any providers, hospitals, clinics, doctors, nurse practitioners, et cetera, who take care of women's health, they can say, I won't give you any care because I don't believe in women's reproductive health. And I'll say abortion care is health care. But this is criminalizing, and what we've seen already because of the Dobbs decision is OBGYN doctors cannot practice to the full extent of their training to provide abortions in certain states, and they are leaving in droves, and you see the closure of hospitals, or maybe not whole hospitals, but maternity wards. There's no maternity care in especially rural hospitals and in hospitals where our communities are. And this is already happening. There's a big cry out among doctors that we need to continue to have women's reproductive health and abortion care, especially from OBGYN doctors. So I'll just say that that's one of the things that's already happening.
Thank you. Thomas?
I think it's important to note what they will not do. And it's in part because, as Dr. Rios said, we've seen it before. Only under Project 2025, it would be on steroids. Basically, the project would have the federal government withdraw from its traditional role of enforcing vigorously our civil rights protections across the board, and would limit investigations basically to what most of us in the room would characterize as anti-civil rights investigations, going after the institutions that have maintained a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion despite the threat and despite the assaults being waged across the country, to challenge those public and private institutions that still believe in civil rights principles of equity and inclusion. So federal government would withdraw. The immediate effects of that are significant. One of the most dangerous elements of Project 2025 is the threat to withdraw from giving any enforcement to regulations that prohibit discriminatory effects. The disparate impact notion of civil rights, which is well established going back 60 years, is the basic idea that if you have significant disparities based on race, then regardless of the cause, that's a pathology that we need to fix. It's something that should not be accepted. The theory of those behind Project 2025 is that we should not be concerned about significant disparities that work against, uniformly, Black and brown communities, but we should only be concerned about intentional racial discrimination where the intent is clear and on the face of what's going on. Where does that happen today? In their view, it only happens when folks are committed to rooting out the disparities that exist and take race-conscious or at least race-aware actions to try to reduce those disparities. The government would then shift sides and be focused on supporting those who engage in practices with dramatic discriminatory effects and charging those who seek to remedy those disparities by using race-conscious or at least race-aware measures. And that withdrawal is extremely dangerous. And ending, I'll just give you one example from the immigration arena. So I hope you all know that a little more than 3 weeks from now, on October 10th, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, Louisiana, will hear arguments in the Texas state case challenging DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The second time it makes it to the Fifth Circuit, and this is the time where it is likely, after a decision is rendered, and we don't know when that will be, certainly after October 10th, not that day or any day soon after, but sometime afterwards, we'll get a decision, and that decision will go to the Supreme Court. If it is a Trump administration, we know that though they are the defendant, because it is Texas versus United States, they will withdraw from doing anything in the Supreme Court to defend DACA, and they will basically realign with the state of Texas and the half dozen other states that are still challenging that program. It will then leave the interveners. I'm confident, because MALDEF represents the interveners, together with the state of New Jersey, which represents another set of interveners, that we can put up a vigorous defense as we have for years. This case began under the Trump administration. But it will be significant to have the federal government essentially realign against DACA and in support of those who are challenging one of the most successful initiatives under immigration law that we've seen in our lifetimes.
Rachel.
You know, I think something that's important to bring into this conversation is some context around Project 2025, and that context is understanding the ideological underpinnings, which we're starting to get from this conversation, right? Project 2025, if you read the introduction chapter, if you read any of the area-specific chapters, that worldview comes through very clearly. And it is a worldview grounded in white Christian nationalism. It's a worldview that wants to promote white Christian patriarchy. And we see that, again, throughout the area chapters. And it's a worldview that's fundamentally in contrast with the project of improving our democracy and of making the US a more fair and equal society. And these themes are heavy in the education chapter, which is my area of expertise. We see this in the civil rights enforcement piece. On day one, a second Trump administration could start the work of rescinding civil rights protections for gay and transgender students. Civil rights protections that have only recently been codified by the Biden administration in their work to improve Title IX. And to speak about things that are already in play, they're already challenging these new Title IX rules. In half of the states, the new Title IX rules apply, and in the other half, where those state attorney generals are party to these federal lawsuits that are starting to work their way through the federal courts, they're still implementing the old Title IX rules that were created by the Trump administration in his first term. We also see, again, as Tom said, this language in the education chapter that suggests they want to weaponize civil rights enforcement to go after school districts that are promoting quote unquote critical race theory or promoting quote unquote gender ideology. And if we step back and think about what they mean when they use these terms, and Trump has said this a lot in speeches. We've heard this a lot in his own agenda, Agenda 47. When they say critical race theory, what they mean are efforts to teach about race and racism. What they mean are efforts to teach more honest and critical histories of the United States that bring in perspectives and voices that have been historically left out of curriculum and syllabi. When they talk about gender ideology, what they mean are efforts to make schools and colleges more safe and inclusive for LGBTQ students and trans students, efforts that are sorely needed. We have so much evidence of the bullying and harassment and the hostile educational environments that trans students in particular are facing. And in some places like Florida and Oklahoma, by virtue of state law. All of that is very practically possible with Project 20, and our proposals outlined in Project 2025 that you could see happening. And on the higher ed side, there are a number of proposals that take aim at student loans, the federal student loan program. The Biden administration has made a number of important changes to the federal student loan program that have reduced monthly payments for borrowers enrolled in any of the income-driven repayment plans and have improved the existing student loan forgiveness programs. The Biden administration hasn't been able to achieve the widespread student loan forgiveness, but they've made important steps to improve the existing programs. And Project 2025 outlines proposals that would undo all of that work. They want to see monthly payments increase. They want to see student loan forgiveness become harder to actualize. And so, there's certainly a lot more in the education chapter, and these are just some of the ones that I see as most actionable and potentially consequential for students in schools.
Thank you all for that. And speaking on higher education, we know already that the reversal of affirmative action has already had a significant impact in colleges. But Thomas, can you talk a little bit about, and Rachel, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, how these sort of anti-DEI efforts further impact the dismantling of affirmative action in higher education?
Well, I think it's by design, and it's already started even before Project 2025. We got to where we did a year ago in June when the Supreme Court decided the Harvard and UNC cases because of a decades-long campaign by people on the right with a particular ideology who were trying to reverse civil rights protections developed in the 60s and 70s, way back in the 70s. And it started with the case that was then overturned last year, Bakke versus University of California Regents in 1978. But that case, which was far from perfect, we should be clear, far from perfect. One of the flaws in the Bakke decision was that it elevated diversity as the only interest that could support the consideration of race in making higher education admissions decisions. And specifically, the conservative justice who decided the Bakke case rejected addressing societal discrimination, even continuing societal discrimination, as an acceptable basis to engage in affirmative action. That's a big problem with that case. But a year ago, this Supreme Court, rejected even the limited scope of affirmative action allowed by Justice Powell, basically to serve diversity. But what we've seen since then is an attempt to take that victory achieved by the right wing after decades of effort and expand it way beyond the actual decision of the Supreme Court, which was confined not just solely to higher education, but to admissions decisions in higher education. And we've instead seen those who campaign, and campaigning means not only threat letters from conservative state attorneys general, it means lawsuits filed that unfortunately in some cases result in settlements that eliminate very powerful programs. But they've targeted not just universities, but private philanthropy. They've challenged government in other sectors besides higher education. And in the higher education setting, they've challenged programs beyond admissions, so that you have some states so inclined that are restricting even programs open to all students, but with a focus on ensuring that we are acting through a justice lens to address the history, the sociology that has been neglected for so long, and through that neglect has resulted in perpetuating the discriminatory effects matching what we've seen throughout our history. So we've seen this expansion beginning with that decision, which was a huge decision overturning a 45-year-old precedent, but an attempt with some success to extend it way beyond its own words. And it's that ideology, as you've heard, is what animates Project 2025. I think it's extraordinary how much it focuses on enforcing an ideology. It's as much about controlling how people think or in government positions of authority as it is about actually taking actions or not taking actions. It's about imposing ideological litmus tests on everybody with any authority in federal government.
Ridiculous.
Thank you, Thomas. And on that same thread, Dr. Rios, you have some concerns about how these proposals to curtail diversity and equity efforts will play out in healthcare. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I have to say is that we're going to have a decrease in access to healthcare services across the board. The Affordable Care Act helped to increase affordable insurance and a lot of other things, but insurance in our country is one way for people of diverse backgrounds to get access to healthcare. We can't afford it without insurance. And insurance in this country went to a lot of people, but out of our 60 million Latinos, 10 million still don't have insurance. And that Affordable Care Act was important and will be rolled back. So we're talking major going backwards in access to care. Now, the Medicaid program, which is now the largest insurance company in the country, I come from California originally, and 1 out of 3 people in California are on Medicaid. There are states in this country that went along with the Affordable Care Act and raised the eligibility. This Project 25 says, let's just cut back on Medicaid, slash it by having work requirements, making you have jobs if you want to apply for Medicaid. And also just getting rid of Medicaid for disabled people, for LGBT people. I mean, again, it's an ideology that's really obvious. And the other big problem is block grants. Instead of allowing funding from the federal government to help everyone, block grants is horrible, to just give money to a state and to do with it what it wants. The other thing that's important to realize with diversity is all the disabled people in our communities. And I'll just say that home care is now, we got used to people working from home, but for disabled people, they need home care. And there is a big push in this country, and the Biden administration has really looked at home care services, social determinants of health. Now people can get paid, not paid, but reimbursed for, let's say, ramps if they're disabled, or air conditioning if they have asthma, transportation using Uber-type programs, food delivery services for people that have to be at home. All of this would be slashed. These wraparound type services. And for education, diversity, and just going along with the Supreme Court decision, as it stands right now, we only have maybe 6-7% of all the doctors in the country are Latino. Even less nurses, less dentists, less pharmacists. And this country is about to see 1 out of 4 Americans be Latino. And I'd say a third at least are Spanish speaking. And our immigrants aren't going to stop coming to be with their families, and our families aren't going to stop speaking Spanish, because especially the elderly that get sick, when you get sick, you want to be comforted. You don't want to be, told you got to talk English, when you're a Spanish speaker. Our grandparents, our parents, and so we really do need more Spanish-speaking Doctors and nurses and allied health people, translators, all of that will go away with this issue of decreasing DEI within admissions. And the last thing I'll say is abortion care is going to be stopped from being trained in medical schools. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's abortion care is health care for women. And to stop it from being talked about, having curriculum, having hospitals provide services is really, I mean, it's just, I don't know what to say. It's very nasty. It's just a very horrible ideology that women in this country are not going to be able to have full women's health care, and training in this country will not be able to train about abortion.
Thank you, Dr. Rios. And just going back to something you said just a little bit earlier about a need for Latino healthcare workers and the shortage of that and how important that is. And we know that, part of filling these very big gaps in provider services is immigration and in a robust immigrant society. But Project 2025 has a different idea. Lourdes, you sort of touched on this earlier, but can you sort of talk about some of the immigration proposals that are concerning to you?
Well, I did mention some of them earlier, but I can drill down a little bit more on them. I mean, I think that, again, pathways to legal migration are definitely threatened under Project 2025, if not actually eliminated. They're calling to eliminate a lot of the programs that our families, Latino families, use, such as DACA and temporary protected status, TPS. There are about 1.2 million people in the country who have TPS. They represent folks from about 16 countries, including Honduras and Nicaragua and Venezuela and El Salvador. And this is under the Biden administration, the number of people who could get TPS was increased, most recently for Venezuelans. So that would definitely be pulled back. I think one thing that I would also drill down on is it's, again, this concept is not just about, the proposals just don't address undocumented people, but really documented immigrants as well would be affected. In our community, people live in mixed families and mixed households of documented and undocumented individuals. So there are proposals in there, for example, that would prohibit non-citizens from living in federally assisted housing, even though the housing was obtained by someone who is documented who is a citizen. So it's that kind of approach that is really worrisome. It's about making it difficult for all immigrants to live here.
And Thomas, I think you'd be the right person for this. Can you provide some historical context to what Lourdes was talking about in terms of past deportation efforts, past mass deportation efforts, and how U.S. citizens have been swept up in them, immigrants who are here legally?
Sure, it's all grounded in the fact that we have a very short-term memory in this country about our immigration system. And it wasn't so long ago, and unfortunately we have some folks like Donald Trump who praised the efforts that occurred under a regime when basically immigration from Latin America was not controlled formally in this country. And that's only 50, 60 years ago. Instead, what happened was these informal controls where people were recruited, welcomed in when they were needed to fill employment. And then when people perceived problems, real or not, with employment in this country, we engaged in massive informal campaigns. A repatriation campaign in the late 20s and early 30s that saw not just immigrants removed to Mexico, but citizens, U.S. citizens of Mexican descent put onto trains and sent back to Mexico because we didn't have a formal system of control. We engaged in these informal controls. And then, of course, the infamous Operation Wetback, forgive the term, it's a term that was actually used in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration that Donald Trump has expressed support for. And that, too, was basically discriminatory, informal, coerced removals from this country. That's basically the only way you can accomplish the kind of repatriation removal that's being talked about by Donald Trump and others. And I want to add Part of this will be accomplished through an unprecedented use of state systems to engage in immigration enforcement. So today, the states of Texas, Iowa, and Oklahoma have their own immigration laws in place that basically allows state court judges, criminal judges, to have those accused of being undocumented brought before them and then ordering them to leave the country. That is unprecedented. That is basically imposing a criminal punishment of exile, which is a medieval punishment, not one that we use in this country. And that's what happens when you allow states to engage in this. Of course, Arizona has a very similar measure on the ballot this November. If you are in Arizona or working on campaigns in Arizona, important as the presidential and Senate campaigns are, Proposition 314 is a very real danger in this country. It would be the fourth state basically seeking to enforce their own deportation system. We cease being one country when we allow every state to have its own deportation policies and practices. And that's what we threaten to unleash under Project 2025, because the emphasis is on enforcement, quote unquote, by any means, and that includes using state untrained, not only untrained, but completely undirected, therefore relying on stereotype, including racial stereotype, law enforcement and judges in state systems without any background engaging in these kinds of activities.
Yeah, and speaking of sort of the infrastructure that you're talking about that exists already in places like Texas and Arizona, but we also know that, Latinos, we're everywhere. We're in North Dakota, we're in Kansas, we're in North Carolina, we're all over the place. What kind of infrastructure exists, if any, to take out mass deportations?
So,
That's a good question.
folks who are undocumented, many of them are not in official federal records, of course. But state records, local records, they do include folks, obviously, who are undocumented. May not indicate that they're undocumented, but when you're interested in mass deportations, regardless of due process and tolerant of racial stereotyping, then all of that becomes very real potential fodder for use in a mass deportation system. Now, it's less of a threat in certain states where we know the efforts will be made to protect the confidentiality of all of that state and local data. But there are other states, you mentioned some of them in your question, of course, where there may be a receptivity, even if very small numbers of immigrants are present in those areas, but there may be receptivity to opening up records that previously would have been considered to be wholly confidential to engage as part of this mass apparatus to remove people. People, in most cases, who have been here for many, many years, raising families, mixed status families, as Lourdes mentioned, because children are citizens, but the parents may not be. So we're talking about massive devastation of families, communities, and important to note, workplaces, because this would be tremendously disruptive to workplaces across the nation.
And Lourdes, what do you think, how would immigrant advocacy groups and community organizations come together if there were mass deportations? Would there be an infrastructure on the sort of NGO side, if you will?
Well, I think that's something that we are better prepared now for this, I think, than we were back in 2017 when President Trump came into office. He had a very strong anti-immigrant agenda. I think those of us, I was in a New York Attorney General's office then, but we worked with other progressive AG offices, and of course there was the entire non-governmental civil rights bar that really tried to push back on that agenda, but we were a little caught off guard, I would say. I think now going into this election and this new, anticipating a new administration, I think there is probably more organization now than there was back then. We're more ready, I think.
Mm-hmm. And Thomas, what can be done legally?
Well, of course, there will be challenges waged, as we saw in the first Trump administration with the Muslim ban, and we saw lots of folks going to the airports when that was being implemented and attempting to assist. I do think that was unorganized, and a lot of folks showed up with expertise that they couldn't tap or didn't have the expertise that was needed, and we were better situated in that regard. But we also have to remember that Donald Trump put a lot of federal judges in courts across this country. And too many of those judges have already demonstrated, after only 4 years, their willingness to put aside what the law is and what the law has always been understood to be, to adopt an ideological version of the law that may be about doing nothing but facilitating the Trump administration in engaging in whatever activities it would like to engage in. And they will do that under the cover of saying this is about enforcing the law. And that's why we also need, in our community, to put a greater emphasis on judicial appointments and nominations when we go out and make a decision about how we will vote. And those of us in this room need to take it upon ourselves to inform our family members or neighbors who are voting how important all of these decisions, including judicial appointments, are for our future.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on what Tom was saying. I mean, again, going back to 2017, I think one of the tools that we used as civil rights litigators, which was an unexpected tool, was administrative law and the power of the judiciary to reverse executive agency decisions. This was, the judiciary has the power to reverse decisions by DHS or DOE that they think weren't done procedurally correctly, like with notice and comment, or if they were arbitrary and capricious or an abuse of discretion. And we really tapped into that power to stop the anti-immigrant agenda, or at least throw tacks in the road to puncture the tires and slow it down. What's interesting is since then, we've seen sort of a major shift in power, I think, at the federal level because of Supreme Court jurisprudence. There was this doctrine for like 40 years called Chevron deference. And Chevron is the name of this Supreme Court case where it basically, the principle was that the judiciary and other parts of government should give deference to federal agencies who are charged with implementing laws passed by Congress, especially where there was gray areas, where it was vague. And that principle was around again for 40 years. And earlier this year, the Supreme Court basically struck down that principle and said, no, the judiciary does not owe that deference to federal agencies. And Justice Kagan in the dissent said that that was basically making the Supreme Court an administrative czar, like a czar over all these federal agencies. And so it's again, there's a very fluid environment here. It's different from where we were in 2017, where there's a lot more power in the judiciary over the executive branch agencies, and to Tom's point, a much different judiciary, both at the district court and court of appeals levels, and of course at the Supreme Court now with a 6-3 conservative majority. So how we'll be able to use some of those tools to defend immigrants and to stop an anti-immigrant agenda is fluid and questionable.
Thank you. We're now going to open up the floor to audience questions. We have a couple of people with mics, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'd love to hear them. We have someone up here.
Where's the mics?
We're supposed to have someone with a mic.
To get you, Mike?
Can you talk very loudly?
Yeah.
Thank you.
say,
Go
just yell.
ahead. We
Just
can
yell.
just project.
Yes, I just question your thoughts on while the president has certain powers, but we do have a checks and balances system in our government. Many come into government thinking they're going to do sweeping changes. Come to find out there are laws, there are policies, there are rules that you can't break, and you can't really fulfill what you promised the country. So, what are your thoughts about the judicial? Our court system, the judicial, the executive, legislative, and the executive branch, having that checks and balances in place to help us create a balance of power, and somebody can't just come in and make sweeping changes like Trump has planned to do.
Can I answer that? In the healthcare world, the Department of Health and Human Services is already tapped to be totally changed. One example, the pandemic, the Centers for Disease Control will be changed to 2 agencies. One that just does data collection, and another one that makes some public health recommendations. But the ideology is, in the Project 25, nobody should close down schools, nobody should close down restaurants, nobody should close down, everybody should just go to work, and if we have another pandemic, which we will soon, there won't be any protection from government. We shouldn't wear masks, we shouldn't, have major community-focused vaccine, and that is something that they're already projecting to do. And the other thing would be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agencies, and climate change. We just had the most expansive climate change funding programs. They call it EJ, Environmental Justice now, and the IRA Act, and all of that would be changed. The EPA last time on the Trump administration, with all of the advisors, the scientific advisors were dropped, and people were brought in that had the own ideology of the Trump administration. So even though you say, well, yeah, we have laws that are there to there's still things that can be done directly by the White House for their executive branch. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the legal, how far they can go. But I think that the writing's on the wall at HHS to change things, the Title IX, and the LGBT, the variables for indicators for programs, just all kinds of things could be just like wiped out.
So all I would say is I've been a litigator for 30 years. I believe in the court system and its contributions to promoting civil rights. But if you are in a situation where you're relying solely on the courts to ensure the protection of civil rights, that's a bad situation. We need to make sure that we don't put people in place who are going to abuse power and take advantage of a court system that in some ways, through delay, through accepting incompetence, is going to permit them to accomplish what they want. This is why Donald Trump can assert he wants to be a dictator, because he thinks the courts will allow him to do it. Well, they won't entirely, but he'll do plenty of damage with what they will, through delay, allow him to do. And that is the problem, is that we saw in the last Trump administration that at least for the first couple of years, their incompetence outweighed their cruelty.
Yes.
And that meant they didn't accomplish as much as they purported to want to accomplish. But by the end of 4 years, it became clear that the courts, including the Supreme Court, would allow certain incompetencies to nonetheless move forward as policy. And that's dangerous.
One thing I'd add, building off of what Tom said, is one of the most radical proposals in Project 2025 takes aim at reshaping the civil service. They want to be able to get rid of career folks who staff these agencies, who know the law, who know what they're required to do, and replace them with party loyalists. And it's another arm of Project 2025. There's this whole personnel recruitment piece that's happening in the background, and they want folks in that position who are able to push through radical changes under the guise of the authority of the executive, and they're hoping that the courts don't check them.
We have only a couple of minutes. Can we just do one more question? Whoever has a mic.
Who can yell the loudest?
Ooh, lots of people.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Fabiana Rincon. I'm one of the student interns with CHCI. And thank you so much for this panel. It has been so incredibly interesting. But to me, Project 2025 is synonymous with the rise or attraction of the Latino far right. So with this phenomena and this new legislation, how do you see it radicalizing members of our community? And what can we do, or what is your advice to getting through to our loved ones who have been radicalized?
It's a great question.
Wow.
Wow.
I'm happy to start by saying I think that we should all realize, including all of your family members, that we are the threat that they perceive. It's not a coincidence that this is coming out now.
Right.
It comes out now because Texas is more in play than it has been in 35 years. And that scares them, because if it follows California, which was turned blue with the leadership of the Latino community, many other communities involved, Colorado, New Mexico turned blue with the leadership of the Latino community, Arizona, Nevada turned purple and trending blue with the leadership of the Latino community, and Texas going the same direction. That's what they fear, because it's game over once Texas flips, at least at the level of presidential elections, for the foreseeable future. So we are the threat they perceive, and we should all see Project 2025 as an anti-Latino 900 pages. 900 pages about countering us.
Yeah.
Rachel, did you want to add something to that?
Not much to add. I mean, it's an anti-democratic document, right? I mean, everything Tom said is exactly right. Like, they want to undermine efforts to address longstanding inequalities. They want to undermine efforts to make this a more fair and equal country, to strengthen our democracy. And it's because we have the numbers, right? Our public education system is predominantly students of color. Right? The young people are predominantly students of color, right? And so, they are going about, like, they're making a last grab at power through anti-democratic means. That is what you're seeing outlined in this document.
Yeah, I would just add, it's exactly that they are, remember, the good news is that they're scared of us. Yep. They're scared of us, of our potential power. And I say potential, it's growing, but we're not. My father is a boxing fan, and there's this, saying about a boxer not punching in his weight class. I don't think Latinos are yet punching in our weight class, given our numbers, given our contributions to our country and our economy. We have like the 5th largest GDP if you counted us as a country in the world. So I think it's about being scared of us, honestly. But to your particular question about loved ones, and I say this on a personal note, not as wearing my hat as leader of an organization, but as a personal note, as a family, have family members who are embracing some of this ideology. As you say, the important thing is not to cut them off, but to continue in dialogue with them, to really show them, how this doctrine, these policies really are not in their best interest, in their family's best interest.
Dr. Rios, would you like to add anything before we close out?
Well, I'll just say that I have family members that also believe in some of these ideologies because they're religious, they're Catholic, they hear, reproductive health and abortion is bad, or LGBT, we shouldn't think about LGBT, and we have family members that are LGBT. But it's just negative behavior. It's not real. It's not, and so I think that there's a lot of, I'll just say, misinformation in their minds, and we need to counter it with information. And not argue, but just counter and put more information in our social media, in all the media ways we can, about the importance of respecting everybody, but also respecting that we do have a diverse community. We're not all for abortion or against abortion. We're not all for LGBT or against LGBT, and that's okay. But this Project 25 is dangerous, and it is going to wipe out a lot of legal things that have happened. And all of our families, we have to go back to our families. All of our families understood the discrimination they went through in the 1940s. And my parents were part of that when the Zoot Suit riots happened. And then in the 50s, when we finally got schools able to have Mexicans in the schools, was it Westminster in Los Angeles, and even the swimming pools, even the hospitals. The hospitals didn't allow people of color to be in the same wards as white people until 1965.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, and then we didn't have affirmative action and financial aid until the 1968. And I started college and saw the first 50 Latino students accepted to Stanford. They were my seniors. I mean, we've lived it. Our families have lived the changes to improve our future families. We can't go backwards. And those people that are in our families that think that way, they're going backwards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rios. Thank you so much to our panelists, Lourdes Rosado, Dr. Elena Rios, Thomas Sainz, and Dr. Rachel Pereira. And before you all go, please welcome to the stage Marco Davis, CHCI President and CEO. He's going to make closing remarks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here today. Please join us in the atrium for the closing reception.
Estoy tan enamorado de la negra Tomasa.